Riley, how's it going?
Good, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. So I guess to start, oh, where to start with Bubba Bo? Uh, just give us the, if you could, just give us the quick, like, if that was your book, what would the inside cover say about you, about the piece, whatever you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, probably just like I don't know what it would say, but I mean, for me, as far as it's like just as something about it is that like I live up here in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, so it's northern Idaho, and there's like a lot of poor white people around. It's kind of like the makeup of the place, and it has been for a long time, and so I used to work in a drug rehab, and while working there, I just came across like just a lot of like really heartbreaking stories in lives that people lived, and it seemed to be kind of like a curse or like just something that came with being. I don't want to say everybody is afflicted with it, but a large number of people seem to suffer from drug addiction and poverty and a lack of education and just the different things that happen in places like this where people get poor over time due to circumstance. And so I based it on a couple different people that I know and just wrote it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. I guess you kind of just answered this, but my question is, right, and feel free to answer this um, as in depth or as lack of in depth
Sure.
as you would like. But my question is, like, it feels so real. I think it was kind of, I think the general takeaway from the story, it feels just extremely real. Like you feel like the narrator of the story lived that. So I guess my question would be, how much of that story is autobiographical for you?
Yeah.
And I know you just said it's kind of this combination of stories, but yeah, riff on that if
Yeah.
if you would like.
Sure. So, like, all right. Well, I mean, I personally have a lot of experience, uh, or I lived on the streets and did a lot of drugs myself. So that's kind of like how I ended up working at a drug rehab in the first place. But I mean, the story itself is mean. It's not true at all. Uh, you know, like the mom stuff, I pretty much all just made up. Um, oh, sorry, that's Alexa. Somebody's Alexa going off. Uh, let's see. So I I just kind of made that up. So the stuff that's really true is like somebody I know uh, is like his dad did kind of die in a similar way. But I mean, other than that, I pretty much made it up. I think that's one thing about writing for me is that like I believe in like making things as real as possible, especially if it's a first person narrative. And I mean, not to talk too much about myself, like in my abilities to write or whatever, but it is something that like I do think is important. If you're going to write in the first person, it should be extremely like the person has to feel real, And so
Absolutely.
I don't know. I spent a lot of time like thinking about that and phrasing and things like that to make it as seem that way, basically. So
Absolutely. I know you're being extremely humble, but I will toot your own horn if since you will not. I think uh, Bubba nails that, right. Like it is the feeling you get is you're just like, right. It is real, right. You feel like that person is
yeah,
a person that like exists, and like you could meet them on the street and have a conversation with
sure.
them, and they would tell you about this life that they've lived.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I think I take that as a great compliment. You've totally
Cool.
achieved
Thank you.
your goal.
Good.
Um, I'm just trying to figure out where to go. There's so many places we could go with this. I
Yeah.
guess my question would be, I guess to dive in on more of the literary side and like the like
Mhm.
process side. Um, what does it? So here, something I noticed about the story was you do a lot of interesting stuff with kind of how you pace the story and where you place detail. Which
Mhm.
I, as someone who writes, find that very interesting. Right, like you'll go into extreme detail about certain things like the fact that like the dad dying and like how his body was found and how he was like decomposing
Sure.
on the floor,
Yeah.
but then you choose to kind of gloss over other things that in like more of a traditional narrative would be expounded on deeply, right? Like the part where
Yeah.
the narrator burns the house down and then spends 6 months in prison, right?
Yeah.
That's like
Yeah.
all happens in like a single sentence. So I just wonder
Yeah.
why do you do that? What is the
Yeah.
if you could just riff on that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think, I don't know, like as far as like some of the like the more like unfortunate stuff, I don't know. I guess maybe just talking to people over the years, it's like, you know, uh, because this may be abnormal, but so my experience in life is just that a lot of the people I know have done have stories that are similar. I know a lot of people that have been to prison for a long time, or did a lot of drugs, or had their whole families burn up in fires and stuff like that, or whatever, just really terrible stuff. And that's just like a product of being like a counselor in a rehab, and then also like living a crazy life. So I guess the thing is that like it's not uncommon for people to share that kind of information in that kind of way. It's like it's consistent with the way that people view their lives when their lives are so crazy, and they like go into prison for 6 years isn't really that big of a deal. And it's like, well, I just was doing this thing. I was trying to get warm, and then a house burned up and I ended up in prison. Which may
Right.
sound crazy, but and then I would say about like the death, like so like why the detail of the death is there is because I think that everybody has a father, in one way or another, and everybody's father is going to die or has died. And so I think that like things like that, um, going to prison might not be something that like the reader would be able to put themselves in the story through that. But I think that having a father die is one way that you can like everybody has a father, and so it like kind of maybe brings the reader into it, although it's towards the end. But everybody has a mother too, and so
Right.
there are some things I think that bring people into the story more, or make it seem more real because they can identify with it on some level. I
Sure,
don't know.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great. I think it does, right? The way you play with kind of what you choose to elaborate on and what you don't definitely works to kind of bring you into the story and make the characters in the story more real, right? Because what you just described, right? Of how like the first thing where it's like these kind of people, it's as if like quote unquote like people that live like a normal suburban nice life, right? They would
Sure.
describe like, oh, and then I woke up and I ran down to the local grocery store and I bought my groceries and came home, right? It's
Right.
described with the same tone as like, oh, and then the house burnt down and I was in prison for however many years and that's just kind of how it
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah.
And I think
Sure.
it plays on this realism because you like feel that, right? Like the as someone who hasn't lived that, right? You feel how the tonal shift, like what I think nice society would consider like horrific events or like very impactful events in a life are treated as like superfluous or almost like, yeah, you know how it goes,
Yeah.
right? Like
Sure.
makes the story so much realer, if that makes sense. Would you agree with
Yeah,
that?
yeah. I definitely I would agree with that. And I think the thing is like for me I don't see it as abnormal life per se. I just see it as a different life. So like I come from personally like very nice life, my parents and everything. And but I left home when I was 19 and then ended up living like I did. And so it just becomes a different life. But yeah, it's true like you're saying. I think the other thing to remember like with all of it is that poverty really does lead to this kind of stuff. So there's like a number of things which afflict a certain culture, and poverty seems to be kind of in some ways a mindset and a cultural thing that is accepted, and with that comes prison. And then I would also say is like in the story with his father and his brother and his mother's deaths, uh it's the way that it is. That's the other thing, is that people die. So like, kind of like a weird fact or something I've been thinking about is like, being poor, like, you're more likely to burn up in a house fire, I think. And maybe that's not true, but it seems like it's true, because I know people who have or have dealt with that stuff. And the reason why is because they're poor. And so instead of having like central heating and air, they have like cheap plugged in appliances overnight, which are more likely to cause a fire. They have bad wiring, or they live in rundown apartments. And so like, you don't think about those things, but those things can lead to death. And like, for me, I know somebody whose neighbors, like, all their kids burned up in a house fire. So it's like something that's very real to hear. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
That
it
was
was
great. That was
it was
great.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it's not awesome, but it's a very salient
Oh,
point. And I
sure.
think this kind of that was kind of something you kind of get out of Bubba in that story, right? Is this feeling of this interplay between, right, these kind of cycles of thought and culture that kind of develop in poorer areas, and these like feelings as if things outside of your control are almost preordained, right? You're like, as if
Mm.
characters in the story are being like pushed down certain paths by like things outside of their control, right? And it's kind of
Yeah.
this tension that we feel a lot, especially like with this kind of discussion in the culture right now, which is like, where do the problems stem from, right? Is it like personal decision making, or is it like larger systemic forces that are just like
Yeah.
uncontrollable, right, due to poverty? And I think your story does a good job of like trying to grapple with that in like a non-abstract way, right? Like it's not just like a hypothetical conversation between like two people in a
Sure.
dorm room, right? It's like what are the real life consequences with this through narrative, and like how do these things work together? So I guess my question for you is,
Mhm.
um what do you think? Do you have a position, right? Do you
Yeah.
think
I
like, yeah, go for it.
Yes. So I think that like, I believe like a lot in personal responsibility, which can be an unpopular way of viewing the world these days. But I think that what happens is that things become like cultural. And so like, whether it's not natural to your humanity to be impoverished and to accept a lack of education for your life. Or like, one thing that happens here is you kind of just do what your father did, or you do what your family does. And so like, well, with the last line of the book, or the last line of the story, if you remember, it's he's seeing a girl that's no good to him,
Yeah.
and the reason he's doing it is because he's desperate for love. And I know it's just like a random place to end it, but the point was that like, it's a mentality, and it's not like one that's like a consciously like, they don't try so a lot of people don't, they're not trying to be that way, but everybody they know did all these things. So like, one thing that I see a lot is because like, where I'm from, no girl that I know, I have two sisters, and so we're all from pretty nice backgrounds. Nobody got pregnant until they were like well into their 20s. And even then, I think most people waited till they were right about 30. I'm 35 and still haven't had a child, or 34. And so I would say that like, where I live now, having a child at like 16 for girls is like pretty standard. Or I don't want to say standard, but if you're waiting until you're well into your 20s, it's not the norm, if that makes sense. And so and that's usually with a guy who is either not the father, or is not a good guy to have a kid with anyway. So the point is that like, the circumstances are a result of the mentality and the culture and the things that people learn to just accept for themselves. And
Absolutely.
it's
Absolutely.
very hard to break those chains if you just keep doing the same thing.
Right. I love that answer. I think that's just a fantastic, just a fantastic answer in general, right? It's kind of a problem I see, at least, or I think we have when we have this kind of discussion about like what are the problems with poverty and how do we fix it and where is like the locus of responsibility lie. I think it the problem the question becomes so simplified, right? And it's either like, well, it's no one's fault and it's just, and like there's nothing you can do about it, and it's like we have to change the system and like rebuild it and reallocate funds and stuff. And the other side is like, well, what you have to do is you just have to like make better choices and don't get pregnant and get your high school and get your high school degree and get a job, right? And get out of
Yeah.
there. And I think like neither of those really, both, the problem with that is both of those points kind of have a locus of truth in them, right? Like
Right.
it does have a lot to do with personal choices, and all of these problems come from a conglomeration of individual choices that individuals make. But like there's the similar problem where it's like, how do you expect, like people do, it's natural to do what everyone around you is doing, right? And like if that's what the culture, if that's already ingrained within the culture, how do we fix that, right? Like how do you convince people not to have children at 16, right? If
Yeah.
that's kind of what's ingrained in the culture. And I just think that the problem is so much more complex than like we
Sure.
tend to want to give it credit for being.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. It is, and 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 the thing is, I would say that like I don't know that I know that like so I don't think that people are necessarily that much. I don't know that they're that unhappy. Having less stuff or whatever it may be. I can't say that happiness existed in my relatively rich, uh, privileged childhood and upbringing. I don't know that there was more happiness there than there is here, where everybody's not privileged and is struggling to make ends meet. Um, so it's hard to say if it really is a solution. If that's what you want, I guess you can get it. You can like work super hard and get educated and all that stuff, or you can be a roofer and also be happy.
Yeah, totally, right. Yeah, I get to go even one level deeper, right? It's like, are we even having the right conversation, right? We kind of take it as a given that like, well, if you're poor, you'd be happier if you were not, right? Like, and you'd be happier if
Right.
you lived like a nice middle class suburban lifestyle, and you like worked a 9 to 5 at Nationwide Insurance or whatever, right? Like,
Sure.
and you made $90,000 a year. So yeah, I
Yeah.
guess my question is, yeah, what do you think about that, right? Like, what do you think about happiness, right? Like, what? How do we generate? I know this is a wildly broad question, but like, how do we
It's
generate
okay.
happiness in our life, and like, what is your philosophy about that?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that happiness is directly correlates to like struggle. Like if you have no struggle in your life, I think that it definitely robs you of the ability to be happy. So like, I mean, I think that that's kind of a problem that we see, and I might be wrong about this, but like through as kids are growing up now, there's no struggle necessarily. Like there is struggle, but the struggles have changed, and there seem to be issues that come from not having like a bigger struggle. So like growing, like let's say like if you were born before 1920, like your life was, let's say you worked on a farm, your life was full of struggle. Like back then people had a bunch of kids uh to make sure that at least a couple of them lived, so they'd have like 12 kids because, 5 were going to die because they didn't have access, or the medicines weren't invented yet, or medical procedures didn't exist to keep all your kids alive like we have today. People worked really hard on farms. Life was just a struggle. And so I think that when life is a struggle, you don't have time to be depressed and like contemplate like your uselessness or whatever it is that people struggle with now. So now everybody's on medicine, and people were depressed back then too, I'm sure, but it was like it was lost in the bigger picture, which was like your kids or the community or making sure the farm didn't dry up and die, or whatever it was, whereas like now it's like, okay, you go to school, and I mean there's struggles there, no doubt, but they seem to be less than. However, it seems to have a greater psychological effect, and I don't know if that's true or not. That's just my idea.
I mean, I'm no I don't even know who would study that, right? I'm no psychologist or
Yeah.
sociologist, but I don't know. I tend to ascribe to a very similar philosophy, right? Like, um, it, it, it's as if we're built as human beings, right, to need a load to bear, right? Like we need a thing to do,
Yeah.
a thing to like struggle against, and and yeah, that's kind of like, right, this like unforeseen downside to like the growing wealth of like the West, and like grow it, like the all this like progress, right, that we're making, and like things are
Right.
easier and people have to work less than they ever have before, and like there's like larger surpluses of food than we've ever had before, and we're not like marching off to fight the Nazis, right? Like um life gets easier and easier for more and more people as like we make quote unquote progress, but like we see these kind of adverse effects, which is like no one, as you would say it, right, like struggles, no one suffers, no one has like a thing to like push against, right? And like
Sure.
as life gets easier and easier, you see more and more people, right, like growing amounts of depression and suicide. And i i,
Hmm.
I mean, like, yeah, of course, like it's impossible to parse any sort of sociological problem like to that level of analysis to like a single variable, but like
Sure.
I would prescribe that like a large part of that is like people don't have a reason, right? Like people don't have reasons to get out of bed in the morning. People don't have reasons to like go work the farm, because like if you don't get up at 9 and go to your job, right? Like what's gonna happen? The answer is like nothing really, and like everyone kind of knows
Right.
that. There's no like urgency. There's no struggle. So I think I totally agree with you. I know that wasn't really a question, but if you have anything to add to that.
No, no. I just, yeah, I agree with that. And I think that like the thing is now we can do it. I mean, you can come up with something to struggle with. Like I have a cousin who, uh, he now he runs marathons and does like Ironmans, and he just tried to run 100 miles. He hit 70 miles, but he had to give up. But the point is that like it's an old quote, and he keeps it in his wallet. I forget who said it, but that like in the future things would become so easy, like people would, you know, pay money just to suffer. And the point being that like not suffering and not struggling is bad for you. And you're completely right. I think in saying that you were made to carry a load, meant to bear some burden in our life. And when we're robbed of that, it's not really good for us, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely. So to tie it back to more of like a broad cultural point, what do you think what do you think the solution is? What do you think the solution is to, um, right, kind of the problems you begin to touch on in Bubba with drug
Mhm.
addiction and poverty and these cycles of like death and despair and child abuse, and you can tie that in, right? What do you think the solution is to like, if you were king for a day, if you had a magic wand, what would you
Yeah.
do to society?
To that, I mean, I would become. Yeah, I would try. I don't know that anything can be done as it is. See, um, there's a couple of things like that I believe make life better, but like we've been talking about, they rob life of a certain, I don't know, sense of purpose maybe. Um, I think one of the biggest things is a lack of community that we don't have, and I just don't. I honestly don't know that it can be restored in America at this point. I think we're too diversified, or too many different peoples, and even in places where there is a relatively homogenous culture, um, it's still been robbed of like of its I don't know what to say, its true tradition or its true essence by companies and corporations. And like I'm definitely like pro capitalism, but I also think that like culture should be emphasized. And so like through like culture and community, like having a sense of purpose, and how do you say this, like you are responsible for other people, not just your own family, but all of but the whole culture around you, and the whole community. I think that those things are the number one, like, ways to fix some of the issues that we have. um I think that drug addiction in particular is like a result of being isolated, feeling like you lack purpose, and really kind of just not liking yourself because of those things. um Whereas
Absolutely.
now, so yeah, so for me, like, my drug addiction was fixed through a number of things, but essentially through a sense of responsibility to other people, where eventually I was able to uh, put everything down, and I could never go back, because I could never betray my duty to certain other people in my life.
That's yeah, that's super super interesting. Do you care? Like, are you? Would you care to expand on that? Like, I think that's really interesting. Like, would you care to expand on like how that happened, or make it a little more?
Yeah,
So
sure.
you can you do not have to, of course.
No, no, no. I don't mind at all. I don't mind at all sharing anything really. I just don't like looking at myself on camera. um, yeah, so like my dad, okay, so I'll just tell the whole story, or as short as possible. I grew up in New Orleans, and like really pretty well to do. Yeah, pretty well to do. Went to really good schools, high schools, two of them, but and so like I was set on this trajectory to become like a doctor or a lawyer or veterinarian or something, go into high education, or get a good full education, and become like a professional, like, who made money. And that was like what I was supposed to do. So I was doing that, but then I like started doing drugs, and like hard drugs, like smoking crack cocaine when I was like 17, doing heroin. I overdosed on heroin when I was 17, had to go to rehab and stuff. And so college kind of became, you know, I couldn't do it because I was smoking crack cocaine basically. Like, I went to rehab, got out, and just continued on with this like crazy life of drug addiction. And so after that, I lived through Hurricane Katrina, and then I ended up on the streets after that. And I lived on the streets until 2013. So it was like 8 years, I think, or 7 years or something like that. And the whole time, like, I determined somehow that I hated my dad, and I like was like trying to like kill him by killing myself, which is probably pretty extreme way to do it. But so like in the worst of instances, like I would like I like have like stabbed myself in front of him, uh, in the leg, and then throwing the knife at him. And I would like literally like verbally blame him, for all my everything. And I would just put it all on him. I almost died a bunch of times. Anyway, so the point is, I wanted to kill my dad by killing myself. And like, I don't know, my life, it was like kind of rough growing up, but I don't know if it was that rough. Anyway, that's just what drugs turned me into, kind of, and what I turned into on drugs. And then he got Parkinson's. And so like I called him, and I knew something was wrong. I thought he was going to have Alzheimer's because he's kind of older. He's 70 now. And I thought maybe he had Alzheimer's, but it turned out he had Parkinson's. And for whatever reason, that just broke me, And now that I felt that he was, not necessarily dying, but sick, and going to be sick until he died, I felt responsible for for him. I took responsibility for everything. So basically, I quit blaming him, and I don't know that he deserved any blame in the first place, but I did quit blaming him, and then I got better after that. And so I viewed my life as something that didn't belong to me exclusively, like it belonged to my family as well. And so it would be wrong for me, to rob them of that. And then on top of all that, like just like looking at my life, it just disgusted me. all the things I did, I mean, it was just really atrocious. And so, uh, looking back on that, there's no way in hell that I can do that stuff again. Like I can't, like I know like a lot of people struggle with trying to stay sober for the rest of their lives and stuff, but I've been sober like almost 8 years, and there's just no way. I just cannot do it. I can't let myself. I can't. I hate lying, so I can't do it because it involves so much lying and then like a bunch of other ridiculous stuff too. So
Sure.
that's the answer.
Yeah, that was I mean, if no one if someone's gonna take if there's nothing else to take away from this interview, it's
Yeah.
that like there's always like that's deeply inspiring
Yeah.
story, I think.
Yeah.
Um, I, did you at this time, like during your recovery, is that when you found writing, or have you always written, or
Yeah.
is that just like something you do for fun on the side?
Yeah. No. So like I was like delusional. Like I had this like romantic idea of like drug addled writing. Like Hunter Thompson or like so when I was 13 years old, I read the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is about Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so like I read that, and I basically began to idolize Ken Kesey, and so that kind of just started this idea of like being a writer. And like to be a writer, I felt that you had you had to have this like, I don't know what the word is exactly, but this romanticized aspect of being a writer, of being like a tortured soul or drug addicted or whatever it was.
And just real quick, sorry,
Yeah.
sorry to
Go
butt in,
ahead. No.
but just for anyone who hasn't read Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, that's like Tom Wolfe story of
Yeah.
Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey writes One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and then kind of like gets deeply involved in the hippie movement, and it's about his like life, and he's traveling all across the country doing a bunch of acid and like writing a bunch of crazy tripped out stuff, and they're doing a bunch of drugs and hanging out with Hell's Angels and like living the total like idolized 60s hippie drug free love like life, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So sorry, so keep going. And you
No.
were you were saying that you kind of idolized this and this idea that you had to be like a
Yeah.
tortured soul.
Yeah. Well, and I can't say that like when I was a kid, I had tried to write a couple of things. I was very young. I don't remember how young, maybe fourth grade or something. And I I had attempted to write, and so I had my mom always telling me, you're going to be a writer. So maybe she planted that in my head too, and so between that and then actually liking writing, and then there was my dad who was always reading, and so I thought it was a good way to get his attention. Not that he didn't give me attention, but I wanted to impress him, and so I thought, well, he reads a lot, and this is all maybe subconscious. It wasn't. This is something I've determined in the last couple of years, or thought maybe this is true. And so with all of that, and then when I was on drugs, like I had like an old Smith Corona Coronet 12 electric typewriter, and I would just like bang out total nonsense on it, and I would do methamphetamines and like write, but it was just all garbage. You can't write if your mind is totally smashed. And so um, I just was like trying to do that, and then I was working in this rehab, and then it was in 2016 this girl broke up with me, and I decided, well, that's it. I'm going to write a book now, and so I wrote this book, a memoir called "A Savage Lost," and it's about just my life on drugs. And um, I started posting stuff on Reddit, and it was pretty well received by the drug communities on Reddit. So you have like uh, the subreddit for drugs is what it's called, R drugs or whatever, and then you have a subreddit for opiates. And like I basically like uh, got a I don't like saying stuff like this, but like essentially a fan base. But for my stories, and there was like a lot of encouragement for me to write a book, which I think maybe on Reddit sometimes people are full of crap, but that's okay. Or maybe they just don't know what they're talking about, and maybe that's. I have a very hard time taking any kind of compliment. I don't even want to hear them, but at the same time, reading like getting like big old how do you call it, like all this like karma of voting like thousands of points, and then like hundreds of comments of people just saying like, dang, like, hey, this is great, this is amazing. And sometimes I would put stuff out that I didn't even think was very good, and they would say that. And so I just wrote this book and I published it on Amazon, and it's got like all kinds of errors in it, but there's some pieces in it, like there's definitely some passages that like I think couldn't be more perfect, and like I had this like vague idea of what I wanted to write, and I didn't know what it was going to be about my life on drugs. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew that there was a perfect endpoint, and so there's like multiple portions of the book which I think I achieved that, and so like I was very happy about that. And then that's kind of where writing started. But then after that, I know this is a long answer, but after that, then like, so I had written like my life of drugs out onto paper, and relatively successful in my own small mind. And but then I couldn't write anything else. It was like a totally different thing to go from that to trying to write fiction or something that wasn't. The struggle is still to like get away from drugs. But I think that the unfortunate thing, and maybe fortunate, is that it allows my experience in my life is a lot of it has to do with drugs. And so it allows me to like create a much realer world, or the writing has much more, I guess, texture, or seems realer because these things are real to me, I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's where writing started.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. Just and what was your memoir called again?
It's called The Savage Lost,
The Savage
by
Lost.
Riley Chapman on Amazon.
Awesome.
But
Well, shameless. I will shamelessly
yeah.
plug your book for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
If anyone wants
It's
to check
been
it out on Amazon.
Yeah, it's been good too, like it's not a whole lot, but if you look at like what regular people sell when they get like a traditional book deal with an agent and a publishing house, like the vast majority of books, like like 98% of books or something, or maybe not that much, but they don't do anything. They don't sell diddly squat. And so and so by myself on Reddit, I've done better than I probably would have done otherwise,
Yeah,
So I'm happy
exactly.
about that.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, there's definitely right. Like even people that get book deals with big publishing houses, right? Most books just collect dust at Barnes and Noble or whatever,
Yeah.
and never get a following. And yeah, this is off topic, but right, I think that's kind of right the new way authors and in the internet age, right? That's kind of how you have to do it, right? You have to build your own
Yeah.
following. Like everything is so open source, right? That you can build your own, like however small or large following organically, right? And then you go direct to consumer that way. And I know that's
Right.
in the weeds of the business of literature, but yeah, I just think that's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I guess to harken all the way back, you mentioned the electrical lead acid test is like influential, but maybe influential in kind of a bad way. Um,
Yeah.
were there any other books that you think are like influential in your life or influential now or anything at all?
Yeah, for sure. Well, like, so I think all that was good. I do think that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was like really, really, really good. Very impressive writing. Um, and but I would say that reading Kurt Vonnegut, Breakfast of Champions, and Slaughterhouse-Five, and a couple of other ones, I thought were just masterpieces of just what a person could do with a typewriter or with a pen or whatever means they use to write. Um, but but then on top of the number one thing for me is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. He wrote All the Pretty Horses. He wrote The Road.
The Road, yeah.
Yeah, he wrote No Country for Old Men, the movies. So, but he wrote his masterpiece, so they say, and I think it's true, is Blood Meridian. And what he did with it, it just like is staggering. You know, the idea that this could be done with pen and paper, like just like create this like I don't know how you say it, just this like incredibly like large, just is an epic, really. Like this like incredible piece of literature. For me, I think that that's like the ultimate like inspiration. You know, so
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
what I would say. Like when I write and when I read or when I think about like the pinnacle of writing, that's it for me.
Awesome. Yeah. I guess okay. So I'll harken all the way back to the beginning of the interview and harken back to Bubba itself. Um, a question. I guess you leave some things kind of vague. And I assume, of course, on purpose in the narrative. And I guess a question for people who have read it and enjoyed it would be something like, why didn't the dad, right, ever come try to get the kids
Yeah,
back?
yeah.
Of course, as the creator, you can leave that vague if you would like. If you have an
No,
answer,
no.
happy to share.
I,
Um,
you know, go ahead. Yeah. Well,
yeah, go
uh,
for it.
um, I don't know. I just know that like that's like something that has happened in is a profound kind of story that I heard from somebody that his whole life he thought his dad didn't care about him at all, and it was different situation, but the basis of the whole father thing fairly true to this person's life, where he spent his whole life thinking his father hated him or didn't hate him but just didn't care. And just like the story, they go back home and they find like the kids find these just like gigantic, like I don't know even know where he got the pictures. I didn't ask too much about it at all, but point is that like I don't know why sometimes stuff like that happens, I guess. And it happened to somebody I know, I guess. The shame maybe of like of having the mother take them, and or maybe just giving up on something that you think is important, but
Right.
your heart's just so broken you don't know what to do about it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's kind of beautiful, right? How that's left ambiguous. Beautiful in like a dark way, of course, right? Like in the way that like,
Yeah,
yeah, sometimes horrific stuff just happens, or people
yeah,
do stuff that like deeply hurts us or affects us, and we kind of never know why, and we're kind of left
yeah,
unsure about like what they were thinking or feeling or the reasons they did what they did, and it's just kind of always like we're never going to get the answer, right? And that's kind of
right. I feel that that's consistent with real life,
yeah,
like obviously in this case it is something that really happened, but like a lot of stuff, and I think about this too with like dialogue, kind of just going back to writing and stuff. They're people, like people when they're talking they repeat themselves, so they misspeak. And like when you're writing dialogue, for example, just like similar to a storyline, trying to make it authentic like real life, like it doesn't necessarily follow like the pattern of like beats. You have your story has beats if you're writing screenplays and stuff like that. um Sometimes life is just not really like a movie or like a novel. um and so I don't know. I didn't even really. I kind of thought about it, like why, but and then when I was thinking about when I was writing, I was like, well, I don't know why, but this is something that did happen. So I shouldn't feel too crazy about leaving it like this.
absolutely.
Yeah.
um yeah, and then so my follow-up question, as like fan reader would be, is like do you as the author think that it could have happened any other way? Does that question make sense? Like could the narrative have
What
played out,
exactly?
like could the whole narrative, like was it preordained, right? Like the
Mhm.
factors outside of the let's just say like the narrator's control were enough that like there was nothing he could do. Does that make sense? Or do you think?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, he definitely could have. And I think that like in the story, there's his sister who has relatively similar, I would say, background. She's a girl, some different issues, but I mean, her life turns out differently, you know. And so I would say that, you know, certainly the opportunity was there, but it just isn't the way that it went for old Bubba Bo, you know. And like I said it somewhere before, but you know, even the name. See, like I studied this out. Like, maybe this is kind of racy, but you know, there's this like story, there's this like study that I hear that like that people with like between like races, people with like the name Jamal and Shaniqua put in, you know, 150 applications to different stores, and then to the same stores they send in 150 applications with the name Emily and Edward Smith or whatever it was, you know. So the point of the study is trying to draw distinctions between the way that races are perceived on their applications, right? But and I don't know that this study has been done, but there have been other studies done where they've made the first names less like intense, and they've just used like more traditionally like African American last names, such as like Washington and Jefferson, I guess, are relatively common names, with the same first names. And then you get a little bit more like it's even. Even like if you use like Mexican last names, you like it's still more even. So the point being that first names are an indicator oftentimes of your socioeconomic background. And so like a lot of times like there's the discrimination a person receives for having a name such as like Jamal or Shaniqua could be perceived or could be discriminated against if your name is Bubba Bo. Like another thing that they do around here that seems to be relatively particular to like poor white people is the girls have Joe at the end of their name, like Amber Joe, Abby Joe, uh, Erica Lou. So they put like these like there's another one too, maybe Sue, like Amber Sue. So they'll have like two first names that like one is like a little bit like longer, and then the second part of it is like one syllable, you know. And that's like those are things that like Bubba Bo, like if your name is Bubba Bo, like I promise you that that's not the name you want to put on a job application, you know. And it's not to say anything about anybody named Bubba Bo, but it's an indicator of socioeconomic background, or it is consistent with certain socioeconomic backgrounds, and so that people perceive that a certain way, and that's just kind of how it goes, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you kind of touched on this, and maybe you don't want to go here, or maybe it's irrelevant, but right, there's kind of this in the zeitgeist, there's this like perceived notion, and like a lot of it is based on like truth, of course, that like right, like poor Black people are discriminated against like in the workforce, right? And
Sure.
people always point to that like super famous study, right, where they like do this exact same job application, but one name has like a traditionally like inner city Black person's kind of name, like Shaniqua or like Jamal or
Shaniqua,
something.
I think the names are Shaniqua and Jamal on the study, supposedly. I'm serious. I think that's what they are.
And the study's been replicated a bunch of times, right? And it kind of continues to
Sure.
come up, right? And they put it against these like traditional like middle class white people names, right? Like Emily.
Sure. Sure.
And there's like this discrimination in who gets selected. And I think what I think is interesting about the point you made is, right, it's like we kind of only see this in terms of race, when like it's a lot of times these kind of issues make way, or these kind of disparities seem to make more sense when we look at them from a socioeconomic perspective rather than a like racial perspective, right? Because while there may be like less poor, like proportionally, right? The thing, like a larger proportion of African Americans are poor than the proportion of white people that are poor, if that makes it
Sure.
right. Like
True.
proportionally, there's a
It's
difference,
true.
but like there's still a ton of super poor white people who suffer from basically almost the identical ails of like the black community, like the
Yeah.
poor black community.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, do you want to riff on that, or what do you think about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I can talk about. I think I just try to be careful about talking about stuff like this sometimes because not that it matters too much. I think you just have to own it. But like you know how society is these days, it's like very crazy. But um, yeah, I definitely think that's true, and like that's what I would say I see here. You know, like that's what the whole thing is about. Like there is like I don't know how you say it, curses or blights on these people's like their existence is hindered by not just like their socioeconomic background but by their mindset, you know. There's a particular like acceptance of things being a certain way, and through that they open this door that will never be closed because they don't reject it. um, where they they accept these things for their lives, and that's poverty through a number, it comes in through different ways, you know. It's just cultural things, and I don't attribute everything to culture. I certainly think there are uh, things which affect your chances of succeeding. um, but yeah, I agree with that, like, and I think that's what I was trying to say with the names is like if you just change, like if you leave the first names and make them less like obvious or like difficult to pronounce or whatever you want to say, and you just stick with like the last names being like Velardes or Washington or Smith, you get less discrepancies in like the number of people that are accepted, you know. And
Yeah.
so it's like you're saying, like, yeah, like your socioeconomic background has much greater influence on where you end up, especially in America in 2020, than the color of your skin. I think I believe that, and you know, I'm certainly willing to be wrong, but that's what I think.
Yeah, I do think personally I tend to come down on your side of that debate. I know that's a hot
Yeah,
issue
yeah,
topic right now,
yeah.
but that's
Oh
kind of the
yeah,
stuff we want to be discussing here at the Void. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of
good.
people that have thoughts and comments in the comment section, and we welcome that discussion on Reddit.
Sure.
Yeah, and I guess my final point I would make on that whole topic is if you want to take the a third race to kind of compare it to, right, and you look at Asian Americans who have
Yeah.
like disproportionate success in the system, one of the things pointing to the names that you'll notice in almost all Asian communities is that Asian children have a like Chinese or Japanese or Korean name, and then they have their like English name that they go by
Yeah.
on like applications and stuff, right? So like I know someone who went to college with me, right? We called her Jenny, but like that's not her real name, right? She's
Sure.
from Singapore, and she has like a very like
Hmm.
Asian Western Asian sounding name that like we can't even pronounce, but like she doesn't go by that
Right.
because like the culture does that, knowing that like it puts their kids at a advantage, right, in the culture for them to be like to have however unfair or fair you want that to be, that kind of is just the truth, right? And they like kind of accept
Right.
that, and they like their culture is designed around like kind of playing the game, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, 100%. I actually worked in a pho, a Vietnamese soup restaurant, and like that's exactly right what you're saying. Like Duck's name was Johnny, and
Yeah,
Nia's name was Nelson, and Tan's name was Tony. You know. So yeah, definitely. I think that, and I think that's fair. You know, like you're free to have your culture, and obviously we're not gonna. Nobody's stopping them from being Asian, but they also understand that like if your name can't be pronounced, that can be a hindrance to your placement in the workforce or whatever it may be.
absolutely. um yeah, we're getting closer now. I don't want to keep you
Yeah,
too long. This has been great, but I will end
yeah.
you with the ultimate cliche question
Uh-huh.
that I end all of these interviews
Uh-huh.
with, which is like, if you if you were talking to someone who loves to read, who maybe is trying to write, and you could recommend them 3 to 5 to however many books you want to recommend them, what would be the book recommendations you would make?
Well, what do you mean by this? Like, do you mean like just regular novels or like books about writing or whatever?
Let's
Whatever.
do. You can do either. But let's do like just run-of-the-mill novels for someone who just like loves to read. May or may not like have an interest in writing.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, if I was gonna recommend books, I recommend Breakfast of Champions, um, Slaughterhouse-Five, basically anything by Kurt Vonnegut. I would recommend One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm reading, everything. There's so much good stuff.
Yeah.
But one thing that's kind of hard for some people, is Blood Meridian. So like I pretty much stick to like I've got like a very very solid central core of books that I like, and so Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. That's not for everybody, but I like Ender's Game. So a lot of
Ender's
stuff.
Game is great. McCarthy has a darkness in him. Like he doesn't shy away from the more horrific elements of human nature.
Sure.
It can turn some. It requires a strong constitution to get through.
Yeah.
To get through McCarthy sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and then on top of that, then he like has this like he uses just the most ridiculous words too. Like it's like he sits there with a thesaurus, which is like a big no-no in writing, can be. Don't use words you wouldn't normally use. But I'm pretty sure he uses as many words as he doesn't normally use. However, though, it's you either see that as genius or ridiculous. I see it as genius, and a lot of people do, but other people just can't get into it.
Yeah, I love McCarthy. I do have some friends that he's not to their liking, but I think they're
sure.
Yeah, well, that all of literature is somewhat subjective. So what are you going to do?
Right, exactly.
And then do you happen to have I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but do you happen to have stuff for like budding writers, people that want to write? Do you have recommendations for that about like the craft or anything?
Yeah, the only thing like I think the most helpful thing that I ever found, obviously there's like all the how do you say this, cliche ones like show don't tell, or being out of don't use the passive voice or whatever. But there's this one video, and I don't even know where it is. Maybe I can link it to something at some point. It's called Populated Prose, and it's just this like instructional video that doesn't really have, I don't know where it comes from, but I watched it and it like taught me about like using muscular verbs and like certain kinds of nouns as subjects and in the sentence, so that like the idea is that you want to use adjectives and adverbs as little as possible to achieve your descriptions. Obviously you have to use them sometimes, but I think Stephen King says this in On Writing, that like adverbs are not your friend. So, but there's just this little video, and for me, I think it like totally changed the way that I wrote and made it readable. So that's all I got. I read like what is it? There's that one. It's like one of the more famous ones is an old one by two guys. I forget what it's called, but
yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That's great. That's perfect. Thank you so much, Riley. It's been awesome. I really hope we can like do it again and continue this conversation. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Hey, thank you, man.
Awesome. See you, everybody.
All right. Yeah.